Galactic Survival Bureau published its 73rd emergency guidebook on a Tuesday, which should tell you everything you need to know about how well the previous 72 had worked. This particular edition, bound in what the Bureau insisted was calming neutral beige, but what everyone else recognized as the color of institutional surrender, addressed a problem that had been plaguing the organized galaxy for the better part of 3 standard years. Not humans as a threat, mind you. The galaxy had plenty of those already, and frankly most species had developed perfectly adequate protocols for dealing with things that wanted to kill them. No. The problem with humans was far more insidious. They had become, through no apparent effort of their own, the single most hunted species in 12 sectors. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were valuable, but because they possessed a truly remarkable talent for triggering every single predatory instinct in creatures that had spent millennia perfecting the art of the hunt. The Bureau's Xenobiology department had spent 18 months studying this phenomenon. Their conclusion, delivered in a 400-page report that somehow managed to be both exhaustively detailed and utterly useless, boiled down to this: humans were prey-shaped. Not in the obvious physical sense, though their forward-facing eyes and bipedal gait did them no favor. No, humans were prey-shaped in their behavior, their decision-making, their entire approach to existing in a universe that contained things with more teeth than them. Exhibit A sat in the Bureau's database as case file HTR 2847, though the human in question would have probably preferred to remain anonymous. A freighter pilot, mid-30s by human reckoning, operating a certified cargo vessel on a routine supply run between Hub Station Waypoint 7 and the mining colonies in the Outer Drift. Standard route. Standard cargo. Standard everything right up until the moment he decided that standard was boring and took what his species charmingly called a shortcut. The shortcut in question involved cutting through the Nephros expanse, a region of space that every navigational chart marked in aggressive red with warnings that translated to roughly "no, seriously, do not go here" in 47 languages. The region earned its reputation honestly. It was home to the Nephrite Consortium, a loose collection of species who had looked at conventional galactic society and decided they preferred the ambiance of barely controlled chaos. More relevantly, it was the documented hunting grounds of something the Bureau files referred to as subject. Everyone else called it the Wraith. The Wraith belonged to a species whose name was unpronounceable by most oxygen breathers, not because of linguistic complexity but because speaking it required vocal cords that could resonate at frequencies that liquefied organs. What the galaxy did know about them could be summarized as follows: apex predators, naturally occurring camouflage capabilities that made them effectively invisible, sensory organs that could detect electromagnetic signatures across a range that would make most scanning equipment weep with inadequacy, and a cultural dedication to the hunt that made it less of a profession and more of a religious calling. The Wraith had been tracking humans for 6 months. Not this human specifically, all humans. Every single one that wandered into its territory with their characteristic combination of optimism and spectacularly poor threat assessment. The Wraith had logged 47 encounters, 47 humans who had somehow survived, not through any particular skill but through sheer chaotic unpredictability that repeatedly violated everything the Wraith understood about prey behavior. It had become personal. The Bureau knew this because the Wraith had done something unprecedented. It had filed a formal complaint. 3 pages, written in precise standard galactic, detailing its grievances with human behavior patterns. The document read less like a legal filing and more like the manifesto of someone whose entire worldview had been repeatedly kicked in the teeth by a species that seemed to operate on the principle that survival instincts were more of a suggestion than a rule. The Bureau's response had been to create the guide, a comprehensive, illustrated, desperately optimistic manual that explained in terms even a human could understand how to avoid becoming a trophy. Rule number 1 appeared on page 3 in bold, underlined text. If your navigation system highlights a region in red and adds alarm sounds, that is not a suggestion for an alternate route. Page 4 contained a helpful diagram showing the difference between a shortcut and a funeral. Page 5 had a note in the margins, added by a tired Bureau analyst. They will not read this. The analyst was correct. The freighter pilot, whose transponder identified him as operating under the designation Wandering Fortune in what was probably meant to be ironic, entered the Nephros expanse. His cargo manifest listed protein supplements, replacement parts for atmospheric processors, and 6,000 units of a beverage that humans inexplicably called coffee, despite it containing no actual coffee. The Bureau's monitoring station picked up his signature immediately, as did approximately 7 other entities with considerably less friendly intentions. The Wraith received the notification 14 seconds later. Its ship, a sleek predator of a vessel that humans would have called deeply unfair if they could have seen through its cloaking field, adjusted course with the smooth precision of something that had done this many times before. Its hunt mind, already attuned to the specific electromagnetic signature that human vessels produced, locked onto the target with the satisfaction of a puzzle piece clicking into place. This would be encounter 40. The Wraith settled into its command nest, appendages interfacing with the ship's neural network, and began the approach pattern that had been refined over centuries of successful hunts. Slow and methodical, matching the prey's trajectory, analyzing movement patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This was the dance, the ritual, the sacred practice of predator and prey that had existed since the first creature learned to fear the dark. The freighter turned left, not a course correction, not an evasive maneuver, just a casual meandering left turn that violated every principle of efficient space travel. The Wraith adjusted, compensating for the change with predatory grace. The freighter then accelerated, decelerated, executed what might charitably be called a loop, if loops were supposed to look like someone had sneezed while drawing a circle, and then resumed its original heading as if nothing had happened. The Wraith's sensory organs focused on the freighter with new intensity. Perhaps the human had detected the pursuit. Perhaps this was some novel evasion technique. Perhaps there was more to this prey than it had initially assumed. The analysis subroutine spun up, processing the movement data, searching for patterns. There were no patterns. The freighter moved through space like it was being piloted by someone who had learned to fly from a manual that had been translated through 6 languages and illustrated with crayon drawings. It drifted, it corrected, it overcorrected. At one point it executed a barrel roll that served absolutely no tactical or navigational purpose whatsoever. Inside the freighter, the pilot hummed along to music that would have been mercifully inaudible to anyone not trapped in the same space. He was, by his own estimation, having a good day. The shortcut was saving him 4 hours. The cargo was secure. The coffee dispenser was working. These were the small victories that made life in the black worth living. He had no idea he was being hunted. He had no idea that the Wraith had spent the last 6 months studying human behavior patterns specifically to counter their particular brand of chaos. He definitely had no idea that his meandering, inefficient, entirely random flight path was systematically dismantling a hunting strategy that had been perfected over millennia. The Galactic Survival Bureau's monitoring station watched all of this unfold with the weary resignation of beings who had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times before. The duty officer, a Fenthril whose species had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still impressed by fire, made a note in the log. Another one. The notation read, Bureau Guide Deployment Status, Ineffective, Human Survival Status, Inexplicably Probable. The thing about being a textbook case is that nobody tells you while it is happening. The pilot, whose actual designation in the Bureau files was now earning its own subsection with footnotes, continued his journey through the Nephros expanse, with the confident ignorance of someone who had confused nothing bad has happened yet with nothing bad will happen. This distinction would become important in approximately 47 minutes. The Wraith, meanwhile, had moved past confusion and entered a state that its species did not have a word for because they had never needed one. Frustration came close, so did bewilderment. The actual sensation was more like trying to solve an equation where the numbers kept changing their values based on no discernible logic. Every predictive algorithm it ran came back with probability matrices that looked like someone had spilled them. Humans were supposed to run when pursued. That was basic prey behavior, encoded into evolutionary biology across 1,000 species. Instead, this human was doing something the Wraith could only categorize as aggressively aimless wandering. The freighter's course had changed 6 times in the last hour, each adjustment seemingly made by consulting some oracle that communicated exclusively through random number generation. The Wraith adjusted its approach. If the human would not follow predictable patterns, it would force the situation. A standard hunting tactic. Drive the prey toward a predetermined kill zone. The Nephros expanse had several debris fields where sensor readings turned unreliable, gravitational anomalies that restricted maneuvering, dead zones where communication systems went silent and no help could arrive in time. The Wraith selected the most appropriate site, calculated the necessary vectors,
and began the methodical process of herding the freighter into position. It fired off electromagnetic pulses designed to spoof sensor readings, creating false threat signatures that would drive the human away from safe routes. It deployed micro-drones that would register as larger vessels, boxing in the available flight path. It engaged every tool in an arsenal that had been refined through centuries of successful hunts. The freighter responded by stopping completely, not a cautious deceleration, not a tactical positioning, just a full stop, hanging in space like someone had forgotten they were piloting a spacecraft. The Wraith's sensors focused on the vessel, hunting for an explanation. Engine failure, systems malfunction, belated realization of imminent danger. Inside the freighter, the pilot had stopped because he had dropped his coffee. The cup had slipped from his hand during one of his earlier unnecessary maneuvers, and he had spent the last 15 minutes searching for it while the ship drifted on autopilot. He found it wedged behind a cargo container, still half full due to the wonders of magnetic sealing, and returned to the cockpit with the satisfied air of someone who had just solved a legitimate crisis. He noticed the sensor warnings immediately. Multiple contacts, surrounding vectors, electromagnetic interference. His training kicked in with the swift efficiency of someone who had been taught proper procedures, and had promptly decided that proper procedures were what other people did. He examined the readings, cross-referenced them with his admittedly outdated navigation database, and came to a conclusion. The sensors were malfunctioning. Obviously malfunctioning, because there was no way there were actually that many ships in an empty expanse. The pilot did what any reasonable human would do when confronted with technical difficulties. He turned the sensors off, and then on again. When that failed to eliminate the warnings, he reduced the sensitivity. When that still showed multiple contacts, he simply disabled the proximity alerts entirely. Problem solved. The Wraith watched this sequence of events through its surveillance feeds with something approaching disbelief. The human had detected the threat, had recognized danger, and had responded by deliberately blinding itself. This was not prey behavior. This was not even foolish prey behavior. This was a category of decision-making that the Wraith's entire cultural framework had no reference for. The freighter resumed course, now flying through space with all the caution of someone taking a casual stroll through a garden, completely unaware that the garden contained things with retractable claws and predatory intent. The Wraith's kill zone approach was now useless. The human was not being herded, because the human could not detect the herding. It was like trying to scare something that had removed its own ability to perceive fear. The Wraith made a decision that violated several hundred years of hunting protocol. It would approach directly. No subtle, no careful stalking, just a straightforward intercept that would end this ridiculous chase. Its ship decloaked, revealing itself in all its predatory glory. A vessel designed to inspire primal terror in anything with functional survival instinct. The freighter's autopilot registered the new contact and adjusted course to maintain safe separation distance. The pilot did not notice because he was examining his coffee cup, wondering if it tasted slightly off or if that was just his imagination. The Wraith accelerated, closing the distance with the decisive speed of a predator that had abandoned all pretense of patient hunting. It armed weapons systems that had been designed for significantly more dangerous prey. It prepared boarding protocols that would allow it to take the human alive, because at this point, the Wraith needed answers more than it needed a trophy. The freighter executed another random course change, this time because the pilot had decided the view was better 17 degrees to starboard. The Wraith's weapons lock broke. In the monitoring station, the duty officer updated the log with a note that would later become required reading for all new Bureau recruits. Human demonstrates textbook evasion pattern by completely abandoning all patterns. Recommend updating survival guide to include section on chaos theory. Also recommend sedatives for monitoring staff. Chat control.
The Galactic Survival Bureau had been established 4,000 years ago to address a simple problem. The universe contained things that wanted to eat you, and it seemed prudent to inform people about which things those were and where they tended to congregate. Over the millennia, the Bureau had expanded its mandate to include environmental hazards, spatial anomalies, and the occasional civilization-ending plague. It had never in its entire history needed to publish monthly updates to a single species-specific survival guide. Then humans joined the galactic community. The 73rd edition of So You Are a Human and Would Like to Continue Being One sat on the desk of Director Phoenix, a being whose species had evolved past the need for physical stress responses. which was fortunate because the current situation would have otherwise triggered a cardiac incident. The guide's latest revision included 17 new rules, each one written in response to an actual incident that had occurred in the previous month. Rule 34. Disabling your senses does not make danger disappear. It makes you unaware of danger. These are different things. Rule 35. If something decloaks in front of you, it is not trying to say hello. Rule 36. Coffee is not essential to navigation. You can wait. Director Phoenix had approved all of them with the weary knowledge that not a single human would read past the introduction. The introduction, which currently said, in increasingly large and desperate fonts, "Please read this before you die." The communication channel chimed. Phoenix accepted it with the resignation of someone who already knew what fresh nightmare awaited. The Wraith's image materialized in the holographic display, and for a creature whose species prided itself on emotional control, it looked remarkably close to what humans would call losing it. Director, the Wraith began, and its translator struggled to convey the precise mixture of frustration and existential confusion in its native language. I am formally requesting intervention. The human is still evading you, Phoenix said. It was not a question. Evading implies intentional action. This human is not evading. This human is existing in a state of perpetual tactical randomness that violates every known principle of predictable behavior. The Wraith's appendages twitched in a way that suggested it was physically restraining itself from something violent. I have hunted across 40 star systems. I have tracked prey through conditions that would kill most species. I have never, in 2 centuries of practice, encountered anything like this. Have you reviewed the updated guide? I have reviewed all 73 editions of your guides. They are comprehensive, well-researched, and completely useless, because they assume humans will follow basic self-preservation instincts. The Wraith paused, and when it continued, its voice carried a note that might have been pleading. This one is currently flying through a debris field, with sensors disabled, while apparently eating something. Phoenix pulled up the tracking data. The human freighter was indeed navigating through a region of space that contained roughly 4,000 pieces of high-velocity debris, any one of which could rupture a hull. The ship's trajectory showed no evidence of evasive maneuvering, just a straight line that somehow managed to thread between collisions through what could only be described as offensive luck. The debris field should have ended this, the Wraith continued. That was the plan. Drive the human into a situation where random movement equals guaranteed impact. But the human is not moving randomly anymore. The human is not moving at all, just straight flight through a region that has a 97% collision probability. And yet no collision, Phoenix observed. And yet no collision. The Wraith's frustration had evolved into something approaching philosophical crisis. I have studied human unpredictability. I have adapted my strategies to account for irrational behavior. But this goes beyond irrationality. This is somehow being lucky through sheer ignorance of how unlikely that luck should be. Inside the freighter, the pilot had discovered that his protein bars had expired 3 months ago, and was debating whether best buy dates were suggestions or actual warning. He had decided they were probably suggestions and was currently testing this hypothesis. The debris field outside his window looked, to his admittedly limited perspective, like a particularly dense asteroid cluster. Aesthetic, really. He made a mental note to recommend this route for its scenic value. A piece of debris the size of a cargo container tumbled past, missing his hull by 14 centimeters. He did not notice. The Wraith had noticed. The Wraith noticed everything. It had watched the debris approach, had calculated the trajectory, had known with absolute certainty that impact was inevitable, and then had watched the freighter drift exactly far enough to the side, caused by some microscopic course correction that the autopilot had made to account for stellar wind variations, to avoid destruction by a margin that was mathematically improbable. Director, I am requesting permission to abort the hunt. Phoenix's attention snapped back to the display. In 4,000 years of Bureau records, no registered hunter had ever formally requested permission to abandon a pursuit. Hunters did not give up. It was definitional to their entire existence. You are certain? I am certain that continuing this pursuit will compromise my effectiveness as a hunter. This human has not defeated me through skill or strength. This human has defeated me through the simple act of being impossible to predict,
because the human himself does not know what he will do next. The wraith's image flickered, a sign of agitation. I cannot hunt what operates outside the fundamental framework of cause and effect. Your complaint is noted and will be added to the file. I do not want it added to a file. I want you to explain to me how this species has survived long enough to achieve space travel. Phoenix considered the question, which was not actually rhetorical. The Bureau had been asking the same thing for 3 years. The current working theory involved the phrase catastrophic success, and a lot of complicated mathematics about probability curve. We believe it involves what humans call stubbornness and what we call a complete inability to recognize when they should be extinct. That is not an answer. It is the only answer we have. The Wraith disconnected without formal farewell protocols, which was either a sign of extreme distress or a pointed insult. Possibly both. Phoenix updated the file, added another note about the ineffectiveness of conventional hunting strategies against human targets, and began drafting what would eventually become the 74th edition of the guide. The new introduction would read, "This guide cannot save you from yourself." In the debris field, the freighter emerged intact and the pilot made himself another cup of coffee, blissfully unaware that he had just accomplished what the Bureau would later classify as a statistical impossibility. The freighter exited the Nephros expanse at 40:22 station time, exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes ahead of schedule, which the pilot considered a personal victory worth celebrating. He celebrated by eating another expired protein bar and humming tunelessly to music that would have been classified as psychological warfare by 3 separate galactic conventions. His cargo was intact. His ship was undamaged. He had no idea that he had just survived an encounter with one of the most feared hunters in 12 sectors. He also had no idea that he was now famous. The Wraith's formal complaint, combined with sensor logs from the Bureau's monitoring station, had circulated through administrative channels with the speed of something deeply embarrassing. By the time the freighter docked at its destination, the pilot's navigation choices had been reviewed by 47 different analysts, all of whom reached the same conclusion: this should not have worked. The statistical probability of surviving the Nephros expanse while flying with disabled sensors through a debris field that had claimed 17 vessels in the past year came out to approximately. The probability of doing so while completely unaware of the danger reduced that number to something that required scientific notation and a footnote about rounding errors. The probability of doing all that while also evading a hunter who had a 94% success rate across 2 centuries of documented pursuits was, according to the Bureau's mathematics division, best expressed as "please stop asking us to calculate this." Director Phoenix read through the reports with the hollow feeling of someone watching their life's work become obsolete in real time. The Bureau had spent 4,000 years developing protocols based on a simple premise: intelligent beings could be taught to avoid danger if provided with adequate information. Humans had arrived and demonstrated that intelligence was optional, information was negotiable, and danger was apparently a matter of perspective. The 74th edition of the guide sat unfinished on the terminal, its introduction reading, "This guide cannot save you from yourself." Phoenix had spent 2 hours trying to continue past that sentence and failing to find words that were both honest and not completely demoralizing. The truth was that the guide had never worked because the guide assumed humans wanted to be saved. What humans actually wanted, as far as Phoenix could determine, was to do things their own way and then act surprised when those things somehow succeeded despite violating every known principle of survival. A communication request arrived, flagged as urgent. Phoenix accepted it, expecting another complaint from the Wraith or possibly a resignation letter from the monitoring staff. Instead, the display showed the human pilot, looking slightly confused but otherwise cheerful, sitting in what appeared to be a freight office. "Hello," the human said, waving at the camera in a gesture that most species reserved for greeting friends. "I got a message saying the Bureau wanted to talk to me. Is this about the route filing? Because I can explain the shortcut." Phoenix stared at the human, searching for any sign that he understood the magnitude of what he had just survived. There was nothing. Just a being who looked mildly inconvenienced by the bureaucratic follow-up. "You flew through the Nephros expanse with your sensors disabled." "Oh," the human made a dismissive gesture. "The sensors were giving false readings. Probably needs recalibration. I filed a maintenance request. They were not false readings. You were being hunted." The human's expression shifted through several configurations that Phoenix's xenopsychology training identified as confusion, disbelief, and then what humans apparently called, "Oh, come on." Hunted. By what? The Wraith. A registered apex predator with 2 centuries of successful pursuit. It tracked you for 6 months. 6 months. The human leaned back, processing this information with the careful deliberation of someone trying to reconcile their reality with actual facts. That seems inefficient. If something wanted to catch me, couldn't it just, catch? This, Phoenix realized, was the fundamental disconnect. Humans did not understand hunting as a ritual, a practice, a cultural framework that required patience and methodology. Humans understood hunting as thing wants other thing, and gets it. The entire concept of the chase as sacred practice was completely foreign to them. It tried, Phoenix said, choosing words carefully. You survived through a combination of random course corrections, equipment failures, that you mistook for malfunctions, and what our analysts are calling catastrophic probability violation. So I was lucky. You were impossibly lucky in ways that suggest either the universe has a statistical bias in favor of humans, or our understanding of probability is fundamentally flawed. The human considered this, then shrugged with the universal gesture of someone who had decided that thinking too hard about something would ruin it. Well, I made my delivery on time. That is what matters. Phoenix felt something that might have been the evolutionary ghost of a stress response. Do you understand that you should be dead? But I am not. That is not the point. Seems like exactly the point to me. The human smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had confused surviving with succeeding, and saw no reason to examine the difference. Is there anything else? I have another run scheduled for tomorrow. Where? Back through the Nephros expanse. The shortcut saves fuel costs. Phoenix closed the communication channel before saying something that would violate diplomatic protocol. The terminal screen still showed the incomplete guide, its cursor blinking after the sentence that now seemed less like an introduction and more like a surrender. The Bureau had spent 3 years trying to teach humans how to avoid danger. It had taken this long to realize that humans did not want to avoid danger. They wanted to ignore it, work around it, or accidentally stumble through it while thinking about something else entirely. The guide could not save them because they did not think they needed saving. Phoenix deleted the 74th edition entirely, and began writing what would become the final version, the one that future historians would point to as the moment the Bureau gave up on protocol and embraced reality. The new introduction was shorter. Humans, you are going to do whatever you want regardless of what this guide says. We know this. You know this. Everyone knows this. However, for legal and ethical reasons, we are required to tell you that space contains things that want to kill you. Please try to notice when this is happening. Sincerely, the Galactic Survival Bureau, and also everyone else who has to watch you survive things that should have killed you. The guide was published the following week. It became the most read edition in Bureau history, primarily because humans found it funny and started sharing it on their communication networks with comments like "they get us" and finally some honest advice. The irony was not lost on Phoenix. The Wraith, meanwhile, had withdrawn to its homeworld to reconsider its entire approach to hunting. It would eventually return to active pursuit, but it would never hunt humans again. Some prey, it had decided, were not worth the existential crisis. The human pilot completed his second run through the Nephros expanse 3 days later, again ahead of schedule, again without incident, again while completely unaware that the Bureau had assigned a dedicated monitoring team to track his progress specifically, so they could study how someone could be so consistently, impossibly, frustratingly lucky. The answer, when it finally came from the mathematics division after 6 months of analysis, was delivered in a single sentence: "We suspect the universe is protecting them out of pure exhausted spite." Director Phoenix had the quote framed and hung it on the office wall right next to the final edition of the guide. It served as a reminder of the day the Bureau learned that sometimes survival had nothing to do with knowledge, preparation, or even basic common sense. Sometimes survival was just about being too oblivious to realize you should be scared, too stubborn to accept you should be dead, and too lucky for any of it to matter. The galaxy adjusted its expectations accordingly.